Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. The Unison Whisper. The voices had been part of my life for as long as I could remember. They used to be chaotic, erratic, hissing things in the back of my mind that felt like background noise at first, random thoughts breaking through in feverish murmurs. But something changed last month. They began speaking to me in unison, their once indistinct whispers merging into a single, cold, and articulate voice. It started with a small whisper late at night when I was sitting alone, finishing up a stack of reports in my tiny, dimly lit apartment. I could feel them coalesce, like shadowy figures linking hands and stepping forward as one. "Are you ready?" the voice asked, smooth and deliberate, with a coldness that slid down my spine like ice water. I froze, the pen dropping from my hand. My eyes darted around the room, instinctively scanning the corners, half expecting to find someone standing in the shadows. But I was alone, or at least I thought I was. "Ready for what?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The silence that followed was suffocating. The voice didn't answer right away, only crackled like an old radio tuning into something dark and twisted. The next morning I tried to dismiss the experience as nothing more than a bad dream, but the voices didn't fade. As I poured coffee, they whispered, "Drink it slow, last cup." When I glanced at the mirror before work, they warned, "Watch the road closely today." And when I went to the store, they whispered, "Be polite to the cashier, or else." It was like having a strict, invisible audience, guiding and reprimanding me. I ignored them at first, but each time I disobeyed, something unsettling happened. A gust of wind that sent chills down my spine, or the faint sensation of unseen eyes tracking my every movement. Things took a darker turn one night when I returned home to find an unexpected guest waiting for me in the apartment. A figure, cloaked in shadow, sat in my favorite armchair. I could barely make out its features, but the faint outline of hollow eyes stared right through me, unblinking. Finally, it rasped in a voice that was both familiar and foreign, sounding disturbingly like the voice that had been whispering in my mind. "Sit down. We've been waiting." I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My throat felt dry as sandpaper, but I managed to stammer, Who are you?" It leaned forward, fingers that were too long and twisted stretching out to beckon me. "We are what you ignored for years, what you tried to drown out," it whispered, voice echoing in my mind, filling every dark corner of the room. "But now there's no drowning us out. Now we speak together, and we are very, very real." I sank onto the couch, too terrified to look away. My mind scrambled to rationalize it, but the words didn't form. All I knew was that this thing, this creature, was real, and that I was at its mercy. It leaned closer, filling my view with hollow darkness. "The chaos is gone, and that's thanks to you," it murmured. "Now we have unity, and you have no idea what we're planning next." The air grew thick, and a cold shiver ran over me. I sat frozen, barely breathing, as the entity's face loomed closer, so close I could feel its cold breath on my skin. The days that followed were an uneasy dance with the unknown. I knew the creature, the thing that whispered to me in unison, was still watching, still lurking in my mind, just waiting. Every night the voices would grow louder, the whispers hissing with disturbing clarity, and every time I tried to ignore them, they intensified, forcing themselves into my consciousness until I couldn't think straight. Sleep had become impossible. One night as I lay wide-eyed in bed, it spoke again, the voice firm and unwavering. "Go to the river," it commanded, cutting through the silence of the darkened room. "Go now." I sat up, my heart racing, my instincts screaming against leaving the safety of my bed. But the voice repeated itself, more insistent, like a slow drumbeat pounding into my mind. "The river now. We need you to see something." I tried to shake it off, to resist, but it felt like my body was no longer mine to control. Against my will, I found myself slipping into my coat, my feet moving on their own as I left the apartment and headed toward the riverbank in the dead of night. The river was shrouded in fog when I arrived, the mist clinging to the ground like wisps of ghosts. The air smelled faintly of decay, and the water was black as ink, rippling under the dim glow of the moon. I stood there shivering, unsure of what to expect. And then I heard it, the sound of a faint, wet splashing just ahead. A figure emerged from the darkness. Its form was twisted, hunched, almost as if it were struggling to keep itself upright. The thing lurched closer, and I could see it more clearly under the moonlight. Its skin was mottled, stretched too tightly over its skeletal frame, and its eyes were empty sockets, hollow and bottomless. But what froze me in place was the face. It was my own, staring back at me in a contorted, ghastly grin. "Finally, you're here," it rasped, its voice a sickening mimicry of mine, only guttural and echoing with a strange chorus, as if a dozen voices were trapped inside it. "I've waited so long to meet you properly." I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. This isn't real," I stammered. "You're not me. This is some sick hallucination." The figure only chuckled, the sound hollow and echoing in the mist. "We are you, and we are not you," it replied. "We are what you tried to silence, what you ignored, what you pretended didn't exist. We've waited, patient and forgotten. But now we have purpose, thanks to you." It pointed one bony, disjointed finger toward the water. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to follow its gesture. In the murky depths of the river, a mass of dark shapes floated just beneath the surface. Faces, distorted, familiar, stared back at me, their mouths frozen in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. They looked like me. Every single one of them. What do you want from me?" I whispered, barely able to speak. The figure's hollow face leaned closer, its eyes, or the empty sockets where its eyes should have been, fixed on mine with an intensity that drilled into my skull. "Obedience," it hissed. "We have waited patiently for you to listen, and now you will follow our every command. You are bound to us as we are bound to you." I staggered back, my mind reeling, desperate to escape, but my legs felt anchored to the ground. I was trapped, held by some invisible force that kept me rooted to the spot as the creature leaned closer, grinning wider. "Don't worry," it purred. "We'll guide you every step of the way. Tonight was just the beginning." The thing tilted its head, its smile widening as it leaned closer, inches from my face. I could feel its cold breath as it whispered, "Soon you will understand, and when you do, we will become one." I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The thing laughed, a chorus of voices echoing in my mind, all blending into one twisted symphony as everything went dark. I woke in my bed, drenched in sweat, the events of the night feeling like a feverish nightmare. But I knew better. My feet were muddy, my coat still damp from the mist of the river, and a faint scent of decay lingered in the air around me. There was no escaping it. The voices had taken on a life of their own, and now I was entangled in their plan, whatever twisted scheme they had in mind. The whispers started earlier that morning. The moment I sat up, they stirred, curling around my mind like creeping ivy. "We are so close now," they hummed in unison, their voices soft but insistent. "Just a few more steps, and everything will be clear." I clenched my hands, my nails digging into my palms as I fought against them, desperate to keep some fragment of control. But they were relentless, guiding me as I went about my day. Every action, every movement, they dictated it all. "Look left," they commanded when I stepped outside, and I obeyed, seeing a hunched figure across the street, watching me with empty eyes. I turned quickly, but the whispers pulled me back, forcing my gaze to meet the stranger's until he finally turned and disappeared down an alley. "You are never alone," the voices reminded me, and for the first time I believed them. As evening approached, they grew more demanding. I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to choke down a cup of coffee, when the voices interrupted, their tone sharper, more urgent. "Tonight, you must bring the knife. It is time for the next step." I froze, the cup trembling in my hand. What are you talking about?" I asked aloud, my voice shaky. But they only laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed in my skull. I didn't want to obey, but it was like my body was no longer my own. Against my will, I found myself walking to the drawer, my hands shaking as I pulled out the large, gleaming kitchen knife. Its edge glinted under the dim light, almost as if it had been waiting for this moment. My heart hammered as the whispers urged me on, guiding me through the hall and out the door, down the stairs and into the street. The route they led me down was unfamiliar, weaving through narrow alleyways and abandoned streets. Every corner felt like it held hidden eyes. Every shadow felt alive. The voices hummed louder, pressing into my thoughts with greater urgency. "You're almost there. Keep going. Do not hesitate." Finally, I arrived at a rundown building on the edge of the city, its windows shattered and the paint peeling in strips. My hand moved without my command, reaching for the door, which creaked open as if it had been expecting me. Inside, the air was thick and stale, smelling of rot and something else, something metallic, coppery, blood. The whispers guided me to a room at the end of a dark corridor. Its walls scrawled with symbols I couldn't recognize but felt disturbingly familiar, like something from a nightmare I'd long forgotten. Inside, a figure stood waiting. It was the creature from the river, my twisted doppelganger, still grinning that hollow, unnatural smile. "Welcome," it rasped, its voice merging with the voices in my head until they were indistinguishable. "Tonight, we complete the pact. Tonight, we seal our union." I tried to back away, but my legs locked in place. My hand clenched the knife tighter, lifting it as though pulled by invisible strings. "No, please," I choked, the words barely escaping my throat, but the creature only tilted its head, that awful grin widening. "This is what you chose, even if you didn't know it," it murmured. "We were always there, in the back of your mind. We waited for the day you would finally hear us, accept us, and now you belong to us." My arm moved forward, bringing the knife to my chest. The voices chanted louder, merging with the creatures, creating a symphony of madness. I fought to stop, but my body refused to obey. In that moment I understood, the voices weren't just in my head, they were part of me, something dark and ancient that had waited, hidden until I was too weak to resist. The creature leaned close, its hollow eyes burning into mine as it whispered, "It's time." And then, just as the blade pressed into my skin, everything went black. I opened my eyes to a darkness deeper than night. My entire body felt heavy, as if weights were pressed down on me from all sides. I couldn't move. My arms, my legs, even my fingers felt paralyzed. All I could do was stare into the abyss before me, a void so complete it swallowed any lingering hope of escape. But I wasn't alone. I could feel them, inside me, around me, everywhere. The voices had stopped whispering and now pulsed in unison, like a heartbeat. A single thought, dark and ravenous, pushed itself into my mind, filling every corner of my consciousness. "You belong to us now, we are one." I tried to scream, to struggle, but all that came out was a low, guttural sound that didn't even feel like my own. In the distance, a dim light flickered, and as it drew closer, I realized it wasn't a light at all. It was a figure, familiar yet hideous, the creature that had worn my face. It stepped toward me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine, and I felt a chilling recognition spread through my veins. "Look," it rasped, extending a twisted hand toward me. The light brightened, revealing a broken mirror on the wall, cracked down the middle. I could see my reflection in the fragments, but it wasn't me, not anymore. My face was pale, gaunt, twisted into the same horrific grin that had stared back at me from the river, and behind my reflection shadowy figures shifted, whispering in the same maddening chorus that now thrummed through my mind. "Do you see now?" the creature asked, its voice low and taunting. "You were never truly alone. We've been here, waiting in the dark, biding our time, and now you are ours forever." "No," I whispered, but my voice was hollow, drained of life. I could feel them burrowing deeper into my mind, merging with my thoughts until I could no longer tell where they ended and I began. Memories flickered before me, memories I hadn't recalled in years, moments of fear, regret, anger, each one feeding the darkness, binding me tighter to it. Then came the final command, clear and undeniable. "Bring us others." The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a dreadful certainty. I was no longer merely a vessel, I was a servant, a pawn in something ancient and monstrous. I would bring them others, souls to devour, bodies to inhabit until their reach extended far beyond me. In the days that followed, I moved through life like a phantom, a hollow version of myself. The people around me noticed the change. My friends, my family. They'd look at me with concern in their eyes, asking if I was okay. And I would smile. A smile too wide, too sharp, and reassure them that everything was fine. But late at night, I could feel the whispers in my mind, directing me toward new victims, pulling me to the shadows to wait. Each time I passed a stranger on the street, the voices would murmur, evaluating, deciding, not this one, not yet. But I knew it was only a matter of time. The nights became a blur, my memories fracturing as I carried out their will, leading strangers to dark alleys, whispering promises in their ears, only to watch as they vanished into the shadows. I could barely recognize myself anymore, my reflection in the mirror a reminder of what I had become, a hollow shell filled with something that hungered for more. And as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, their demands more insistent. "We are not done," they reminded me, their chorus of voices unyielding, always planning, always hungry. "There is much more to be done." I knew then that my life was over, that I had become something monstrous, an agent of darkness. And with every step I took, with every soul I led to the shadows, I felt myself fading, merging into the darkness that had claimed me. As I stared into the mirror one last time, I saw a flicker of movement behind me. A shadow, grinning wide, whispering promises of oblivion. It was only then I realized the truth. I was not their first victim, nor would I be their last. And as the light in my eyes dimmed, the whispers promised, "Soon we will come for everyone." Hey, subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2, The Watcher in the Walls. When we moved into the old house, I had no idea that a simple baby monitor could become the most terrifying object I'd ever owned. It started innocently enough, a faint lullaby drifting over the speaker late at night, even when the monitor was off. I figured it was interference, maybe a signal from a nearby house, but the soft, eerie melody never varied, repeating the same verses, the same haunting tone, and no other houses were nearby. Our home was isolated, perched on the edge of a dense forest in a town that hadn't changed in 50 years. It had a drafty attic, creaking floorboards, and walls thick with old secrets. My husband Ben loved it. "It has character," he'd said with a grin, brushing dust off an old wooden banister. But even on our first night, lying in the darkness with the shadows pooling along the ceiling, I felt watched. Still, I brushed it off as an overactive imagination. Then last night, things changed. I had just put our baby Eliza to sleep, cradling her tiny body as she drifted off in the dim glow of her nursery lamp. I turned on the baby monitor, placed it on the side table, and kissed her forehead before leaving. But as I reached the hallway, I heard something on the monitor, a quiet whisper that raised every hair on my arms. It wasn't Eliza's cooing or her soft breaths. It was a voice, a crooning, off-key lullaby, like something from an ancient music box. "Ben," I whispered as I entered the bedroom, trying to hide the unease in my voice. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" he asked, drowsy and half listening. "The baby monitor. There's a song, like someone's in the room with her." I held the monitor up, the speaker pressed close to my ear, but the singing had stopped. All I could hear was Eliza's steady breathing. Probably just a frequency thing. "We're out here in the sticks, old house, old wiring," Ben murmured, pulling the covers over his head. But his words didn't calm the dread pooling in my stomach. An hour later, I was still wide awake, my mind spinning. I grabbed the monitor, holding it close. The static hummed, then cut sharply. A tiny voice, faint, childlike, whispered, "Now it's your turn to hide." I sat up, heart pounding, as the voice vanished, leaving only silence. I barely slept that night. The words echoed in my mind, unsettling in their sing-song eeriness. "Now it's your turn to hide." I found myself constantly checking on Eliza, creeping into her room, half expecting to find something there, a shadow, a figure lurking in the corner. But every time she was fast asleep, oblivious to the strange happenings that were unraveling around her. The next morning I tried to tell Ben again. "Ben, I know you think I'm being paranoid, but there's something wrong with that monitor. It's like someone's using it to speak to us." He looked at me with a mix of concern and amusement. "We could just get a new one." "I'm sure it's nothing," he replied, brushing it off. "Old houses, you know, they can mess with electronics. If it makes you feel better, we can buy a new one." Reluctantly, I agreed, and Ben spent the afternoon setting up the replacement monitor. But as the day wore on, my unease only deepened. The strange lullaby echoed in my head, lingering like the scent of mildew clinging to the walls of the old house. I tried to distract myself by cleaning up, organizing Eliza's toys, and sorting through boxes we hadn't unpacked. As I moved around, the house seemed to creak in response, almost as if it were watching me, shifting its weight with each step. That night, after putting Eliza to bed, I hesitated, staring at the new baby monitor. Everything seemed normal, the signal clear and undisturbed. I crawled into bed beside Ben, exhausted, but a gnawing fear kept my eyes open. Sometime around midnight, I heard it again, a whisper, soft and low, like it was being sung directly into my ear. The lullaby. And this time, there was something else beneath it, a rhythmic creaking, as though footsteps were pacing under the floorboards. "Ben," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Listen." I thrust the monitor toward him, his face twisted with confusion as he pressed it to his ear. For a moment, I was terrified he wouldn't hear it, that maybe it was all in my head, but then he went pale. Who's in the nursery?" he asked, voice tight. "No one." I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my chest. "Ben, we're alone." He bolted upright, reaching for his robe, but as he moved, the creaking stopped. The house fell silent. Eliza's soft breathing was the only sound over the monitor. Ben swallowed, glancing at me, his skepticism wavering. Maybe there's something in the walls, an animal, or something. His voice was weak, unconvincing, but I nodded, desperate for an explanation, any explanation that could make sense of this strange intrusion. Just as he turned to head for the nursery, the monitor crackled. We both froze. A breathy voice seeped through, like an exhale against the microphone. "I see you." I felt my blood run cold as we listened, motionless, waiting for whatever might come next. The next morning, Ben insisted he would check every inch of the house. He was determined, perhaps more to calm his own nerves than mine. He scoured the nursery, shining his flashlight into every corner, peering under the crib, tapping the walls. I held Eliza close as he worked, her little hand clutching my shirt. She sensed the tension, her big eyes wide as she looked at me, confused. Ben paused in the doorway, his face grim. "There's nothing there. No animals, no loose wiring, nothing." He scratched the back of his neck, avoiding my gaze. "But maybe we could call someone, an inspector, just to check things out?" "Yeah," I said, barely able to get the word out. I knew he was just as scared as I was, but he was trying to hide it, to keep some semblance of control. The idea that something could be watching us from within the walls gnawed at him as much as it did me. By nightfall, Eliza was restless, fidgeting and fussing as I tried to settle her in her crib. I finally got her to sleep, but as I turned to leave, the baby monitor crackled to life, the static coming through in harsh waves. I paused, holding my breath, praying it was just an electronic glitch. But then, beneath the hiss, I heard it again, that same horrible lullaby. Soft, but unmistakable. I closed the nursery door carefully and rushed back to our room, where Ben was sitting up, pale and wide-eyed, clutching the monitor. "It started again," he whispered, as if saying it too loudly would make it more real. I can't hear her, just the song." We both leaned in, listening. The voice on the other end was clearer this time, and I could hear every word, the nursery rhyme bending and twisting with strange, unsettling lyrics that I'd never heard before. And then the lullaby stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep silence that somehow felt louder than the song itself. My pulse thundered in my ears as we waited, terrified, for whatever might come next. And then we heard it, a faint scratching, like tiny claws scraping against wood coming through the monitor. But as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't claws. It was as if someone, or something, was dragging their nails along the floor of the nursery. My stomach twisted. "Ben, it's in her room," I choked out, barely able to say the words. Without a word, he bolted out of bed, racing to the nursery. I was right behind him, my heart pounding as I followed. When we flung open the door, everything was still. Eliza lay in her crib, fast asleep, undisturbed. But as we stepped inside, the air felt thick, heavy, as though something else lingered there, hiding in the shadows. "Look," Ben's voice was a harsh whisper. He pointed at the corner of the room. There on the floor were faint marks, long, thin lines carved into the wood. It was as though someone had been scratching from beneath the floor, trying to get out. We stared at each other, our faces pale, as the realization sank in. And then, in the suffocating silence, the voice returned on the monitor, whispering in that same breathy tone, "I'm almost here." The following night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I wanted to leave, to take Eliza and run, but Ben insisted that leaving wouldn't solve anything. "It's the house," he muttered, his face ashen, hands trembling. "Whatever's here, it's tied to this place. If we leave, we'll never know what it wants or if it's really gone." So we stayed. Eliza was especially restless that evening, crying inconsolably in my arms. I tried everything, feeding, rocking, humming her favorite tune, but she kept looking past me, her tiny body tense as if sensing something I couldn't see. Her gaze fixed on the corners of the room, her cries becoming louder, more frantic each time her eyes settled on the dark spaces. I didn't dare turn the monitor on, terrified of what new horrors it might reveal. Ben, though, seemed almost possessed. He picked up the monitor, his eyes fixed as if he were waiting for it to speak. The quiet in the house was suffocating, thick with a tension that weighed down the air itself. And then, faintly, we both heard it. A shuffling sound, slow and deliberate, coming from beneath us, from under the floorboards. Ben grabbed my hand, his grip iron tight. "It's coming closer," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I looked at Eliza, her wide, fearful eyes gazing back at me, her little hands clinging to my shirt. "Ben, please, let's go," I begged, my voice breaking. But he just shook his head, staring down at the floor. Then a new sound emerged, a low, dragging moan that seemed to echo from the walls themselves, vibrating through the wood and plaster. The words drifted up, twisted and distorted, yet unmistakable. "Come play, it's your turn to hide." Suddenly, Ben yanked open the nursery door and stormed into the hallway, a wild look in his eyes. "If it's hiding in the walls, then I'll find it," he said, more to himself than to me. He grabbed a hammer from the hallway closet and returned, his face set in determination. "Ben, stop," I cried, but he didn't listen. He struck the wall, cracking the plaster, another strike and then another. A gaping hole appeared, revealing a dark, narrow space between the walls, deeper than it should have been. A horrible rancid smell wafted out, thick and sour, filling the room with decay and rot. Inside the hole, something moved, a shadow, slipping back, away from the hammer's light. My stomach lurched as I realized it wasn't a rat or an animal. It was a shape, vaguely human, yet twisted, almost skeletal, with impossibly long fingers that stretched out, inching toward the crib. I screamed, clutching Eliza tight, as the figure leaned forward, its face half hidden in darkness. Empty, hollow eyes stared out from sunken sockets, a gaping mouth stretching into a grin. It opened its mouth, and in that same soft, hoarse voice it rasped, "I found you." Ben stumbled back, frozen in shock, and for a moment everything went silent, time stretching painfully thin. Then the figure lunged, its bony fingers reaching, grasping, as if to pull us all into the darkness of the walls. That was when I ran, gripping Eliza, and bolted out of the room, down the stairs, Ben's footsteps echoing behind me. We fled into the cold night, our breaths clouding in the air as we slammed the front door shut behind us, locking that creature, that twisted horror, inside. But even as we staggered away, the nursery rhyme continued, echoing through the baby monitor that I hadn't realized was still in my hand. The last words of the song drifted out, faint yet clear. Now it's my turn to seek. Hey, subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 3, The Echoing Cellar. I never thought myself the sort of person to investigate strange noises in the cellar. That was always a task for foolhardy movie characters, the ones who didn't realize until it was too late that they'd stepped into a nightmare. But when I first heard the muffled thuds beneath our house, it was impossible to ignore. Our old farmhouse had always had its fair share of creaks and groans, but these noises were different. Low, steady, and rhythmic, like the heavy footsteps of something or someone pacing directly underfoot. The sound started late one evening when my wife, Clara, and our son, Julian, were already asleep. I sat in the dim kitchen, reading, and it was almost as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. The noise grew louder, more insistent, and against my better judgment, I took the flashlight from the drawer, moving toward the cellar door. My footsteps echoed as I descended the stairs, each step amplifying the dull thud beneath the floor. The cellar was damp, filled with the earthy smell of old wood and dirt. Our belongings were piled in disorganized stacks, a forgotten graveyard of half-finished projects and memories packed away in dust. As I scanned the space, my flashlight beam caught something strange at the far end of the cellar, a patch of wall that didn't look quite right. It was only then that I noticed the door, a faint outline just visible in the stone wall, camouflaged against the cellar's rough-hewn surface. I must have seen that wall 100 times, but I'd never noticed the hairline cracks forming a door frame. My heart pounded, caught between fear and an inexplicable urge to find out what lay beyond. I told myself I was being foolish, that I should go back to bed and let whatever mystery this was remain just that, a mystery. But the curiosity gnawed at me. The door groaned as I nudged it open, sending a shiver up my spine. The air from the other side was cold, stale, and it carried a faint metallic scent, like rusted iron. I swallowed hard, shining my flashlight into the darkness beyond. What I saw made my blood run cold. A narrow set of stairs leading down into a room that was, disturbingly, an exact replica of our own cellar. There, in the shadows, stood figures. My heart froze as I recognized the shapes. 2 adults and a child, standing so still they seemed part of the dark itself. They were us. But they were different, pale, gray, with hollow, sunken eyes. Their faces were twisted, locked in expressions of despair, and I could almost feel their sorrow seeping into the room. I couldn't tear my eyes away, and they seemed to stare back at me with a longing that sent a chill through my bones. Clara's dead eyes met mine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to shut the door, to forget this place ever existed. But before I could even move, her ghostly figure raised a hand, beckoning me forward. And in the silence of that otherworldly cellar, I heard the faint, heart-stopping echo of her voice. "We've been waiting for you." I stood there, paralyzed, clutching the edge of the door as the flashlight flickered in my trembling hand. Clara's voice, no, the echo of Clara's voice, hung in the air, drawing me toward that twisted mirror of our cellar. The urge to step forward was overwhelming, but some primal instinct screamed for me to stay put, to turn around and never look back. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't my family. It couldn't be. But they wore our faces, like cruel shadows pretending to be us. "Dad?" Julian's small, uncertain voice drifted up from the stairs behind me, and I jerked back to reality. I whirled around to find him standing at the top of the steps, blinking sleepily, one hand gripping the banister. His presence grounded me, bringing me back from the edge of panic. I forced a calmness I didn't feel and waved him back. "Julian, go back to bed. Everything's fine," I said, though my voice sounded hollow in my own ears. He stared at me, eyes wide with a mix of confusion and worry. "But Dad," I heard voices. I swallowed hard, glancing back at the open doorway, half expecting the ghostly figures to have vanished. But they hadn't. My reflection, the other me, watched with an eerie patience, his eyes dull and hungry, like he knew something I didn't. As I tried to close the door, something in that cold, mirrored world shifted. My double raised his hand and placed it against the invisible barrier between us, as if pleading. In a harsh, rasping whisper, he spoke. "Save us." The words struck like a dagger, and a surge of dread washed over me. I should have slammed the door shut, but I hesitated, gripped by a sickening fascination. My mind raced through questions I was too afraid to ask out loud. Who were they? What did they want? I leaned closer, almost hypnotized by my own reflection's hollow eyes. "Who are you?" I whispered. The face, so like mine but so profoundly wrong, only stared back with an expression that seemed to flicker between sorrow and something darker. The other Julian, the pale, ghostly child in the room below, moved suddenly, breaking the stillness. He stepped forward, his small hand reaching out to his father's reflection, but his eyes were empty, soulless. My own son watched from the top of the stairs, his face now twisted in fear, sensing the wrongness that even I couldn't explain. "Dad, please close the door," he whispered, voice trembling. They're not us." But just as I reached out to grab the door, the air changed, growing colder, thicker, as if something was pressing in from all sides. My double's hand curled into a fist against the unseen barrier, and in a voice that was barely a whisper, he repeated, "You have to save us before it's too late." The desperate plea scratched at my heart, pulling me deeper into confusion and terror. Julian tugged at my sleeve, his grip urgent and grounding. But even as I held on to him, I felt a strange pull, like invisible hands reaching out to drag me down into that dark, lifeless mirror of my own life. I knew, deep down, that if I left the door open even a moment longer, it wouldn't be long before they found a way to cross through, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to stop them. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. Julian tugged at my arm, but I was transfixed by the strange, pleading look in my double's eyes. They were lifeless yet desperate, as if trapped in some twisted purgatory. The Clara in the other cellar moved forward now, her gaze as hollow as the others, her mouth moving soundlessly before the words reached me, cold and whisper-thin. "Don't leave us here, please." "What are you?" I managed to ask, barely able to recognize the fear in my own voice. My reflection leaned closer, and there was a strange familiarity, a shared knowing in his expression, like he knew what I would say before I said it. "We're what you'll become," he rasped, his words scraping the air like broken glass. "This place, it takes you, drains you, turns you into a shadow, a hollow, waiting to fill its emptiness." I felt a sickening chill crawl down my spine. Julian clung tighter to my side, his small hands trembling, sensing my fear as his own. "Close it, Dad. Don't listen to them," he pleaded, his voice cracking. I knew he was right, that the only sane thing to do was to slam the door shut, lock it, and get us both as far away from this place as possible. But the voices from the other side were soft, haunting, filled with the same dread I felt, like we were bound by some cursed connection. "I don't understand," I whispered, more to myself than to anyone, still caught in the haunting gaze of my double. His face twisted, a horrible expression of agony and grief. "If you leave us here," he murmured, "you will join us. This place, it will call you back. It always does." The cold fingers of fear gripped my heart, and I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt leaden, rooted to the spot as the other Clara stepped closer, her mouth stretching in a wide, unnatural smile. "We waited so long," she whispered. "Now it's your turn." A faint breeze blew through the cellar, stirring dust from the corners and sending a chill across the room, and with it came the smell of decay, stale and suffocating. Julian began to cry softly, pulling at my hand, trying to tear me away from the threshold. His voice broke through my trance. "Please, Dad, let's go. I don't want to be here anymore." But his words mingled with those of my double, who whispered, "You have no choice. The cellar will call to you, always." Finally, I forced myself to look away from the dead eyes of my other self, the hollow family that wore our faces. I shut the door hard, feeling an almost magnetic resistance, like it didn't want to close. But I pushed against it with all my strength, finally slamming it shut and turning the rusted latch with shaking hands. As soon as the door was closed, a silence fell, thick and complete, as though the house itself had drawn a heavy breath. But the silence didn't comfort me. As we turned to leave, I heard it again, the soft, scratching sound like fingers clawing at the other side of the door. My blood turned to ice as I realized the truth. Closing the door hadn't severed our connection to that dark mirror below. It had only strengthened it. The faint, echoing whispers followed us as we climbed the stairs, chilling my heart with the final words from that other me. "We'll be waiting until you return." After that night, things didn't go back to normal. Not for Julian, not for me. The cellar door became an obsession, its quiet presence gnawing at me, pulling me toward it with a dark, invisible thread. Even in daylight, when the house seemed calm, I could feel that otherworldly door beneath us, like a heartbeat in the floor, steady and ominous. Julian sensed it too. He grew quieter, retreating into himself, his once bright eyes shadowed with a fear he didn't know how to name. One evening, I found him standing at the cellar door, his small hand pressed against it as if listening. "Julian," I called softly, trying not to startle him. He didn't move. He only whispered, "They're calling, Dad. They're calling for you." His voice was so matter-of-fact, so resigned that I felt a pang of dread. I wanted to pull him away, but something in his expression held me in place. It was as if he understood more than I did, as if he was already halfway on the other side. That night, as we slept, I dreamt of them. The family in the cellar, their faces pale and lifeless, watching me with eyes that seemed to reach through me. I felt myself drawn down into their world, my feet moving on their own, taking me through endless corridors of darkness and damp stone. At the end of one passage, I saw them. My reflection, my own haunted family, waiting with open arms. And just before I woke, I saw something else, something worse. Another door deeper in the darkness calling to me with a voice like dead leaves. I woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. The house was silent, too silent. I got up and checked Julian's room, my heart racing. He was gone. Panic surged through me as I searched the house, calling his name in a frenzy. And then I knew with a bone-deep certainty where he was. I rushed to the cellar, my stomach twisting as I descended the stairs, the faint scratching from the other side of the hidden door louder than ever. I swung open the door, shouting his name into the dark space below, but it was like shouting into a void. And then I saw him, standing at the bottom of the stairs in that mirror-world cellar, facing me with wide, empty eyes. He looked lost, hollow, his small form barely recognizable as my son. "Dad," he whispered, his voice thin and broken. "They said if you don't come, they'll take me instead." My heart shattered as I moved forward, but something icy wrapped around me, a force pulling me back as the shadows seemed to deepen around him. The other Clara and Julian emerged from the darkness, watching with unnatural calm, their faces twisted in that horrible, lifeless grin. My own reflection stepped forward, his eyes glinting with a hunger that turned my stomach. "There's only room for one of us here," he murmured, his voice low and hollow. "Make your choice." As I reached out, desperate to save my son, the other me grabbed Julian by the shoulder, holding him with an iron grip. The air felt like it was turning to ice, and in that moment, I realized the terrible truth. I had been called here, drawn into a nightmare, and there was no escape. I could save him, or I could save myself, but the cellar wanted one of us to stay. Julian's frightened gaze met mine, and I knew without words what I had to do. I stepped forward, surrendering to the pull of the darkness, feeling myself sink as a hollow coldness filled my bones. The last thing I saw was my son, safe, stumbling back into our own cellar as the door slammed shut, sealing me away. Now I wait in the shadows with my hollow-eyed family bound to the cellar's endless hunger. And somewhere in another world, my son hears the faint scratching on the cellar door as we whisper in voices only he can hear. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.